He flew home from his last chance with $7 in his pocket. Not a metaphor. Literally $7. One bill, some change, after years of training, a scholarship, and the absolute certainty that his body and his will would be enough. They weren't. The same man now controls a billion-dollar empire, has held the title of Hollywood's highest-paid actor for years running, and has generated serious public conversation about the presidency of the United States. But between those two moments, the $7 and the empire, lives a story the highlight reels were never built to hold. A mother who walked into traffic, an arena full of thousands chanting for his failure, a private depression that the most physically imposing man on earth refused to hide. How does a man rebuild an identity when the dream that defined him is gone? What does it actually cost to become The Rock? And why did he name his billion-dollar company after the worst day of his life? Before we answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. There is a particular kind of burden that comes with inheriting a legend. Not the burden of wealth or expectation in the conventional sense, but the quieter, heavier burden of a name that already means something before you have had the chance to discover what you mean. Dwayne Douglas Johnson was born on May 2, 1972, in Hayward, California, into a family where greatness was not an aspiration. It was an assumption. And assumptions, for a child still trying to understand the world, can feel less like inspiration and more like a sentence already written before you have spoken your first word. His father, Rocky Johnson, was a man of genuine historical significance. One of the first black tag team champions in WWE history, Rocky had carved his name into a sport that did not welcome him easily, fighting his way through racial hostility, industry skepticism, and the particular exhaustion of being a pioneer in a space that had not prepared itself for his arrival. He was powerful, disciplined, and commanding. A man who had earned every inch of the ground he stood on. He was also, by most accounts of those who knew the family, emotionally unreachable, not cruel, not absent in the physical sense, but sealed behind a wall of discipline and expectation that left little room for the softer architecture a child needs. Warmth, patience, the simple reassurance that love is not conditional on performance. Rocky Johnson measured the world in toughness. In his household, vulnerability was not a language that was spoken. It was a dialect considered dangerous. In his mother, Ada Johnson, arrived with her own extraordinary lineage. The daughter of Peter Maivia, a Samoan wrestling legend whose name still carries reverence in the sport's history, she brought warmth and resilience in equal measure. She was the emotional center of the family, the one who laughed and held and stayed. But warmth, no matter how genuine, cannot substitute for stability. And stability was the one thing the Johnson family could never quite afford to keep. Because the wrestling circuit does not stay still. By the time Dwayne was old enough to understand geography, he had already lived across more cities than most children his age could name. California, Hawaii, Tennessee, New Zealand. Each move carried the same promise. That this city, this booking, this opportunity would be the one that finally made the finances settle. Each promise arrived and dissolved on roughly the same schedule. There were stretches of genuine poverty, not the softened, made-for-television version of hardship, but the kind that shows up in specific, humiliating details. Counting coins before a grocery run, watching a parent's face in a checkout line, and learning, without a single word being exchanged, exactly how much money was left. Wearing the same clothes longer than other children, understanding earlier than any child should, that the distance between dignity and desperation is measured not in character, but in dollars. And then came Nashville, and the motel, and the moment that would follow Dwayne Johnson for the rest of his life. He was 14 years old. His mother had driven them to a motel, another temporary address in a long sequence of temporary addresses, and something in her had reached a breaking point that day. The accumulated weight of instability, financial pressure, and the particular exhaustion of a woman holding a family together with insufficient resources finally found its edge. She parked the car. She sat still for a moment, and then she stepped out and walked directly into oncoming traffic. A passing driver stopped in time. Atta Johnson survived. But Dwayne, the 14-year-old boy sitting in that passenger seat, watching the woman who represented safety itself choose that particular exit, carried the image of that moment for decades before he could speak about it publicly. When he finally did, and in an interview that stunned millions not just with its content, but with the quietness of its delivery, he described it simply as the most terrifying moment of his life. What it also was, though he could not have articulated it at 14, was the moment his understanding of strength permanently changed. Because the woman who walked into that traffic was not weak. She was a woman who had carried too much, for too long, without enough support. And the boy who watched her had just learned, in the most brutal possible classroom, that strength is not the absence of breaking. It is what you choose to do in the aftermath. Football arrived as salvation. By his teenage years at McKinley High School in Honolulu, the physical transformation that would eventually make him one of the most recognizable bodies on earth had already begun. He was broad, fast, and ferociously competitive. The kind of athlete whose presence on a field changes the calculation for everyone around him. Coaches noticed, recruiters called. And for the first time in his young life, Dwayne Johnson had something that felt genuinely, solidly his. A talent that no eviction notice could take away, no city change could interrupt, no family financial crisis could repossess. The University of Miami offered him a scholarship, one of the most celebrated college football programs in the country. A roster filled with players already moving in the direction of professional greatness. He arrived in 1990 with a single, unambiguous belief that this was the beginning of the story he had always been meant to live. He was right that it was a beginning. He was wrong about which story. The University of Miami was not what he had imagined. Not because the program failed to deliver on its reputation. It delivered precisely. The coaches were exceptional. The facilities were elite. The culture of winning was embedded in every practice, every film session, every early morning run. The University of Miami, in the early 1990s, was not simply a college football program. It was a conveyor belt pointed directly at the NFL, and most of the men sharing that locker room with Dwayne Johnson were already on it. He was not. The gap between good and exceptional in elite athletics is one of the sport's most merciless truths. It does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself quietly, in the accumulation of small moments, a step too slow on a route, a decision made half a second late, or a physical ceiling reached while the men around you continue climbing. Dwayne was good. He was disciplined, powerful, and deeply committed. But the roster ahead of him included players already destined for Pro Bowl selections and Super Bowl rings, and the coaching staff, operating under the ruthless arithmetic of competitive football, made their evaluations accordingly. He spent the majority of his college career watching from the sideline. Not as punishment, not as oversight, simply as the natural consequence of a depth chart that had no room for potential when it was already stocked with the finished product. He graduated with his degree, a fact worth noting, because many men in his position would have abandoned academics the moment the athletic dream began to dim. But the NFL draft came and went, without his name being called. And the silence of that day, a silence he would later describe as one of the loudest things he had ever heard, was the first adult confirmation of a fear that had been quietly building since his freshman year. The Canadian Football League offered what felt, at the time, like a lifeline. The Calgary Stampeders signed him in 1995. He arrived in Canada with everything he owned, the last reserves of a dream he had been carrying since he was a teenager in Honolulu, and the particular desperate optimism of someone who knows this is the final door and refuses to consider what lies beyond it if it closes. It closed in 2 months. He was cut from the roster before the season had truly begun. It released with the standard language of professional sports that manages to be simultaneously polite and devastating. Thanked for his effort, wished well in his future endeavors, escorted back to the beginning. He booked a flight home. When he landed and reached into his pocket, he found $7, one bill, and some change. The entirety of what remained after the airfare, after the years of training, after the scholarship and the dreams, and the absolute certainty that his body and his will would be enough to carry him somewhere worth arriving. $7. He sat in his father's car outside the airport and stared at the money for a long time. What followed was not the cinematic resilience that his later story might suggest was inevitable. What followed was collapse. Depression arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a slow withdrawal, a gradual dimming of the engine that had powered him since adolescence. He stopped training. The discipline that had defined every morning of his life since high school simply evaporated, as though the dream that had justified it had taken the motivation with it on the way out. He stayed in his childhood bedroom for days at a time. Friends called, and he did not answer. Opportunities presented themselves in small ways, and he could not summon the energy to reach for them. He would not speak publicly about this period for many years. When he finally did, the honesty was startling. Not because depression in young men is rare, but because men of his eventual stature almost never name it directly, and without apology. "I was in a bad place," he said simply. "Not just financially, emotionally, mentally. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I didn't know who I was without football." That last sentence is the most important one, because it names something that the athletic dream, at its most consuming, always risks creating. An identity so completely fused with a single outcome that its absence does not simply disappoint. It amputates. Dwayne Johnson did not know who he was without football. And in that emptiness, in that quiet, unglamorous, unfilmed bedroom, in a house that represented everything he had feared returning to, the real story began. Not with a roar, not with a training montage, but with a father sitting down beside his broken son and saying, with an unusual gentleness that the man had rarely extended during the years when it might have prevented some of this damage, "It's our time now, not your time, to our time." Rocky Johnson had spent his career fighting for recognition in a world that underestimated him at every turn. He understood, in a way few others could, what it meant to claw back from the edge of invisibility. And what he offered his son in that moment was not a solution. It was something more valuable: companionship in the difficulty. The simple, revolutionary act of not leaving. The $7 stayed in Dwayne's mind long after the wallet was replenished. Not as a symbol of shame, but as a coordinate. A fixed point on the map of his life that everything afterward would be measured against. He has never let himself forget it. And he has never let himself stop being grateful. that it was not the last point on that map. The wrestling ring has a particular kind of cruelty, reserved for those who arrive without a name. You can arrive with a body. You can arrive with athleticism, with timing, with the raw physical gifts that the sport demands. But none of it matters if the audience does not feel you. And the audience of professional wrestling in the late 1990s was one of the most instinctively perceptive crowds in the history of live entertainment. Tribal, passionate, and completely immune to anything that smelled like it had been manufactured in a boardroom, rather than forged in genuine character. Dwayne Johnson arrived in the WWE in 1996 as Rocky Maivia. The name itself was a declaration of lineage, stitched together from his father Rocky Johnson and his grandfather Peter Maivia, to two men whose names carried genuine weight in the sport's history. The intention was clear. Here is the next generation of a wrestling dynasty. Here is the man who inherits the legacy. The crowd's response was immediate and merciless. Within weeks, the chants began. 3 words, delivered with the cheerful cruelty that only a live audience can produce, bouncing off arena walls and landing with the precision of something aimed rather than accidental. Die, Rocky, die. Not silence, not indifference, which would have been easier to absorb. Active, sustained, organized rejection from the very people he was supposed to captivate. For a man who had already survived being cut from the Canadian Football League, who had rebuilt himself from depression and $7 and a demolished athletic dream, this was a wound of a different geometry. Because this rejection was not delivered in a quiet office or an empty locker room, it was broadcast to millions every Monday night, amplified by arenas full of people who had paid money specifically to be there and who were using that money to tell him, collectively and enthusiastically, that he did not belong. He had 2 choices. He could soften, adjust, sand down the edges of the character until it became something the audience might find more palatable, a safer, more cautious version of himself, designed to minimize the hostility. Or he could do something far more dangerous. He could lean into it. What happened next is one of the most studied transformations in the history of sports entertainment. Rather than retreating from the crowd's contempt, Dwayne Johnson absorbed it and redirected it and weaponized it. He began to inhabit a character so electrically self-assured, so ruthlessly entertaining, so magnificently convinced of his own greatness, that the audience's hostility had nowhere productive to go, except laughter. And from laughter into something that looked, and then became, genuine affection. The Rock was not created in a creative meeting. He was not the product of a rebranding exercise or a carefully managed image consultation. He was born in the furnace of public contempt, hammered into shape by thousands of people chanting for his failure, and emerged on the other side as something the wrestling world had rarely produced. A character so completely inhabited that the line between performance and personality became genuinely impossible to locate. By the late 1990s, the transformation was complete, and the reversal was total. The same audiences who had chanted for his demise were now chanting his catchphrases with the fervor of people reciting something sacred. "Can you smell what the Rock is cooking?" became a cultural phrase that escaped the boundaries of professional wrestling entirely and entered the broader vocabulary of American pop culture. Multiple WWE championships followed. Feuds with Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, and Mankind that are still studied as masterclasses in character work and crowd psychology. Pay-per-view main events that drew television numbers the company had rarely seen. He had done what almost no one who starts from that particular place manages to do. He had taken the audience's worst verdict and turned it into his foundation. But even at the height of his wrestling fame, something was already shifting beneath the surface. The crowds were enormous. The championships were real. The cultural footprint was expanding in ways that surprised even the most optimistic observers within the company. And yet, Dwayne Johnson, sitting in arenas full of 70,000 people chanting his name, was beginning to feel the ceiling. Not with resentment, but with the particular restlessness of someone who understands, instinctively, that the story they are living is a chapter and not the whole book. Hollywood had been watching, and for the first time in his life, a door was opening that had not been there before. Not because someone had unlocked it for him, but because the man on the other side of it had finally become someone worth letting in. The boy who had once been invisible was about to walk into the most visible industry on Earth, and this time he was not going to the bench. The entertainment industry has a long and well-documented history of underestimating people. It underestimated the mailroom clerk who would one day redefine television. It underestimated the broke kid from Compton who would eventually own the label. And in the early 2000s, it underestimated the professional wrestler who walked onto a film set for the first time and was quietly, confidently expected to fail. The transition from professional wrestling to legitimate Hollywood stardom had been attempted before. It had produced, with very few exceptions, a graveyard of careers that burned briefly on the novelty of the crossover and then dissolved when novelty proved insufficient to sustain a real film franchise. The industry had a template for what a wrestler-turned-actor looked like, and the template was not flattering. A Dwayne Johnson arrived determined to rewrite it. His first significant screen appearance came in 2001 with The Mummy Returns, a supporting role modest in screen time, but enormous in immediate cultural impact. Audiences noticed him within seconds of his appearance. The physicality was expected. What was not expected, what surprised casting directors, producers, and the audiences themselves, was the warmth, the humor, a screen presence that did not simply occupy the frame, but seemed to genuinely enjoy being inside it, inviting everyone watching to share the experience. The Scorpion King followed in 2002, and with it came a number that announced itself loudly in an industry that speaks almost exclusively in the language of money. A $5.5 million payday is setting a record at the time for the highest salary ever paid to a first-time leading man in a studio film. The boy who had flown home from Calgary with $7 had just negotiated a contract worth more than most people earn in multiple lifetimes. But the money was not the story. The money was a data point. The story was what came next, or more precisely, what almost didn't come next. Because for several years following that early promise, Dwayne Johnson found himself navigating a purgatory that the industry constructs specifically for people who arrive from unexpected places. He was not fully embraced by Hollywood, which still regarded him with the polite condescension reserved for novelties that have not yet proven their staying power. And he was no longer fully present in wrestling, which had released him into a world that was still deciding whether to claim him. Roles arrived in waves. Some carried genuine potential. Many did not. Doom, The Tooth Fairy, Race to Witch Mountain. Films that used his body as spectacle and his charisma as decoration. Projects designed around the brand rather than the talent. Each one collecting its paycheck and departing, without meaningfully advancing the larger argument that Dwayne Johnson was trying to make about himself. He later reflected on this period with the directness that had always been one of his most useful qualities. "I made some bad choices," he admitted. "I chased the wrong projects. I confused being busy with moving forward. They are not the same thing." The realization arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, accumulating clarity. And he was working constantly and advancing intermittently. The infrastructure of a career was being built, but the architecture was wrong, optimized for immediate revenue rather than long-term legitimacy, for the path of least resistance rather than the role that would finally force the industry to take the argument seriously. The turning point, when it came, looked from the outside like a supporting role in an already successful franchise. Fast Five in 2011 was not a project Dwayne Johnson needed for the paycheck. By that point, the financial foundation was secure enough that the decision was entirely strategic. He chose the film, and chose specifically to enter it not as the lead, but as a supporting character. Because he understood something that very few stars at his level of recognition are willing to accept. And the right story, told beside someone else, is worth more than the wrong story told alone. His chemistry with Vin Diesel was immediate and combustible. Two immovable objects generating friction so entertaining that it elevated every scene they shared and propelled Fast Five to become the highest-grossing entry in the franchise to that point. Critics who had spent years writing him off as a novelty act suddenly found themselves searching for a more precise vocabulary. Audiences who had followed the franchise for a decade responded to his addition with the enthusiasm of people who had not realized something was missing until it arrived. From that single strategic decision, the trajectory never reversed. Fast and Furious sequels, Hercules, San Andreas, Central Intelligence, and Jumanji. Welcome to the Jungle, a film that defied every expectation attached to its premise and generated over $900 million at the global box office. Hobbs and Shaw. And then, after more than a decade of patient, determined maneuvering through an industry that had repeatedly underestimated him, Black Adam in 2022, a DC Comics anti-hero that Dwayne had spent 15 years fighting to bring to the screen. Not because of the spectacle, not because of the franchise potential or the merchandise revenue or the streaming deals that would follow, but because of the character at the center of it. A man of immense power, morally complex, operating in the space between hero and villain, defined not by simple goodness, but by a more complicated and more honest kind of humanity. A character, and in other words, who could not be neatly filed under any single verdict. The parallel to his own story was not accidental. It was deliberate, and it was personal. By the mid-2010s, the argument had been won. Dwayne Johnson was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, a title he would hold for multiple consecutive years, confirmed annually by the kind of industry accounting that does not traffic in sentiment. His production company, $7 Productions, named without apology or irony after the $7 in his pocket the day the Calgary dream ended, was generating content across film, television, and digital media. His Terramana tequila brand, launched in 2020, became one of the fastest-growing spirits brands in American history, adding a business dimension to the empire that even his most optimistic early supporters had not predicted. The industry that had handed him the tooth fairy and quietly waited for the novelty to expire had watched him instead become one of the most bankable and versatile entertainers in the history of the medium. He had not succeeded despite the wrestling background, the Canadian Football League rejection, the purgatory years, and the bad choices. He had succeeded because of the specific kind of person those experiences had built. Someone who understood failure from the inside, who had learned patience the hard way, who knew that the right decision made slowly is worth infinitely more than the wrong decision made quickly. The war for legitimacy was over. The man who had won it was already thinking about something more important. There is a version of Dwayne Johnson that the brand requires: disciplined, unshakable, 4 a.m. alarm, iron in the gym, iron in the boardroom, iron in every room he enters. The version that posts the workout before the sun rises and captions it with something about outworking yesterday. The version that never cancels, never wavers, never allows the machinery to slow long enough for doubt to find a foothold. That version is real. It is also incomplete. Because running parallel to every box office record, every franchise negotiation, every carefully constructed milestone in the public architecture of his career, there was a private man living a private life that looked almost nothing like the highlight reel. And that private man was, on more than one occasion, genuinely struggling in ways that the brand could not acknowledge, and the image could not afford to show. The first fracture arrived not as a dramatic public event, but as the quiet, accumulated erosion of a marriage that had been carrying more weight than any marriage should be asked to carry. Dany Garcia had been beside Dwayne Johnson since their college years at the University of Miami. She was not simply his wife. She was his first real architect, the person who had looked at the man emerging from the wreckage of the Canadian Football League rejection and the depression of his mid-20s, and seen, with a clarity that he himself did not yet possess, the precise shape of what he could become. She built the early framework of his Hollywood strategy. She negotiated when he was still being underestimated. She constructed the professional infrastructure that made the transition from wrestling icon to film star possible, rather than merely aspirational. When the marriage ended in 2008, it did not end cleanly. It could not, because the professional partnership did not end with it. In a decision that puzzled observers and impressed those who understood both of them, Dwayne and Dany chose to remain professionally intertwined after the personal relationship dissolved. She continued as his manager. He continued to trust her judgment above almost anyone else's in the industry. The marriage had ended. The alliance had not. To those on the outside, it seemed either impossibly mature or quietly dysfunctional. To those who knew them, and it was simply the honest conclusion of two people who had always been better colleagues than spouses, and who were sufficiently self-aware to acknowledge it without allowing pride to destroy something genuinely valuable. But the emotional cost of that transition, restructuring an entire life while continuing to show up professionally alongside the person you had lost, was a weight that Dwayne absorbed largely in silence. There were no tabloid meltdowns, no public accusations, no dramatic exits, just the particular invisible exhaustion of a man rebuilding his private self while his public self continued to expand. And into that exhaustion, depression returned. Not the acute collapse of his post-Canadian Football League years, the weeks in bed, the engine gone completely silent. This was something more insidious, a chronic to low-grade darkness that accompanied him through the years of professional acceleration, arriving without warning and departing on its own schedule, indifferent to the box office numbers and the Forbes rankings and the arena crowds chanting his name. He spoke about it publicly for the first time in 2018, in an interview that landed with the particular weight of something long overdue. The revelation itself was significant. The manner of it was more so, delivered without drama, without the careful management of a publicized vulnerability, without any of the strategic framing that celebrity confessions so often carry. "I reached a point where I didn't want to do anything," he said quietly. "I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to get out of bed. I hit a wall." For a man whose entire public identity had been constructed around forward momentum, around the almost mythological discipline of someone who simply does not stop, the admission of that wall was an act of courage, that no production budget could manufacture, because it contradicted everything the brand had been carefully built to communicate. And he said it anyway. What followed the interview was something neither he nor his team had fully anticipated. The response was enormous. Not the prurient fascination that celebrity confessions sometimes generate, but something quieter and more genuine. Millions of people, men especially, who had been carrying their own versions of that wall in silence, suddenly finding in his words a permission they had not known they were waiting for. Messages arrived from people who said they had finally made a phone call, finally spoken to someone, finally named a thing they had been refusing to name, because the most physically imposing man on earth had just told them that walls are real, and admitting their existence is not weakness. That impact, unplanned, unbranded, impossible to manufacture, became one of the most meaningful things he had ever produced. More meaningful, by his own account, than any film he had made, or any championship he had won. He also spoke, in the same period, about a relationship that the public had watched develop from a distance, without fully understanding its depth. Lauren Hashian had entered his life in 2007, arriving quietly during the years of professional rebuilding and personal restructuring, and when the Dwayne Johnson the world was watching had not yet become the Dwayne Johnson that history would record. She was not drawn to the empire. She arrived before most of it existed. She stayed through the construction of it, and she witnessed, without flinching, the parts of the man that the construction did not always show. They married in 2019 in a ceremony in Hawaii, the islands where he had grown up, where his family's roots ran deepest, where the story had first taken its shape. Their daughters, Jasmine and Tiana, born in 2015 and 2018, had already restructured his understanding of what the whole enterprise was actually for. He had built an empire. He had finally figured out who he had built it for. There is a question that empire eventually asks every man who builds one. Not the question the industry asks, about revenue and market share and franchise potential and the next project, and the one after that, but the quieter, more demanding question that arrives in the silence between achievements, in the space between one alarm and the next, in the particular stillness of a house where children are sleeping and the noise of the world has temporarily stopped. What is this actually for? Dwayne Johnson arrived at that question later than he might have, and earlier than many men at his level ever do. And when it came, it did not arrive as a philosophical abstraction. It arrived in the specific, irreducible weight of a daughter's hand in his, in the sound of a child laughing in a room down the hall. In the moment, he watched his eldest daughter Simone step into a professional wrestling ring, the same kind of ring where her grandfather had once fought for recognition, the same kind where her father had once heard thousands of people chant for his failure, and sign her name to a WWE contract that made her the first fourth-generation superstar in the history of the sport. He wept. Not the composed, camera-ready emotion of a press appearance, not the carefully managed vulnerability of a man who has learned to deploy feeling strategically. The unguarded, unhurried tears of a father watching his child choose the arena that had once tried to reject him, and realizing in that moment that the rejection had been part of the inheritance too, that what he had passed down to Simone was not simply a famous name or an open door, but the specific knowledge of what it costs to walk through that door and keep walking when the crowd turns against you. That knowledge, he would say quietly afterward, is worth more than any title. His three daughters, Simone from his first marriage, Jasmine and Tiana with Lauren, have done what no professional achievement ever fully managed. They have reorganized his priorities from the outside in, restructuring the architecture of his daily life around a set of values that the empire, left to its own momentum, would never have naturally produced. Presence over productivity. Patience over pace. The ordinary miracle of a bedtime story told without checking a phone. Over the extraordinary spectacle of a global premiere. He still wakes before dawn. The discipline has not softened, but its purpose has changed. So it is no longer the desperate engine of a man outrunning the memory of $7 and a demolished dream. It is the grateful ritual of someone who understands, with the clarity that only survival can provide, that the body is a borrowed thing, and time inside it is not guaranteed. The philanthropy that has grown alongside the empire carries the same signature. His work with the Dwayne Johnson Rock Foundation has directed resources toward terminally ill children, young people navigating circumstances that mirror, in their specific cruelty, the helplessness he witnessed in his own childhood. Not poverty as abstraction, not hardship as a talking point in a press release, but the granular, unglamorous reality of families counting coins at checkout counters, of children wearing the same clothes too long, and of young people whose potential will never be discovered because the circumstances of their birth made discovery impossible. When wildfires devastated Hawaii in 2023, the islands where he had grown up, where his family's history ran deepest, he did not post condolences and move on. He funded relief efforts directly, publicly, and challenged others at his level of wealth to match the moment, rather than simply acknowledge it. Some called it performative. He absorbed the criticism with the patience of a man who has survived far more precise attacks than social media disapproval, and emerged with his convictions intact. "I don't need the credit," he said. "I need the help to get there." That sentence contains, in miniature, the entire architecture of who he has become, on the other side of every fall. Not the man who needs the spotlight to validate the action. The man who uses the spotlight to point toward something larger than himself. He has already spoken openly about his will. His daughters will not inherit billions in passive wealth. The money will flow instead into foundations, children's health care, creative education, scholarships for young people who begin with nothing, and whose potential the world has not yet had the decency to notice. "I don't want my girls to inherit money," he has said. "I want them to inherit values. And I want children who start with nothing to inherit the chances I never had." In that decision lives the fullest expression of the transformation. And the boy who slept in motels and counted other people's money from a distance has become a man redirecting his own fortune toward children who remind him of himself. The athlete who was told he was not enough has spent decades telling other people they are. The man who sat in a car with $7 and felt the story end has built an organization named after those $7, $7 Productions, as a permanent public reminder that the ending is never where it appears to be. At 52, the physical evidence of the journey is present for anyone paying attention. The accumulated toll of decades of professional wrestling, of stunt work, of the relentless physical demands of blockbuster production lives in his body now in ways that discipline alone cannot fully address. Torn tendons, multiple surgeries, and the kind of damage that time eventually presents as a bill, regardless of how carefully the account has been managed. He trains smarter now, with the awareness that longevity is the goal, not spectacle. With the understanding that the body kept strong today is the body present for a daughter's graduation, a grandchild's first word, a morning 10 years from now that he does not want to miss. The anxiety still visits. The darkness still arrives occasionally, without announcement. He has said so, plainly, without apology. and without the framing of someone performing vulnerability for an audience. It arrives. He gets up anyway. He has been getting up anyway for 30 years, and the repetition has not made it easy. It has made it practiced, and practiced is enough. And because the truest measure of Dwayne Johnson, the one that will outlast the box office records and the Forbes rankings and the championship belts and the tequila valuations, is not the empire. It is the man the empire could not make, and the failures had to build. The boy who watched his mother walk into traffic and learned that strength is a choice. The young man who flew home with $7 and refused to let that be the final coordinate. The wrestler who heard thousands of people chant for his failure and decided, in the merciless clarity of that moment, that their verdict was not his definition. He did not become who he is despite those chapters. He became who he is inside them. And in that truth lives the only lesson worth carrying from his story: that the hardest moments are not the interruptions to your life. They are the making of it. And now, as this chapter closes, the question belongs to you. Not the version of you that the world sees, the real one. The one that knows exactly which dream was cut, which door was slammed, which morning felt impossible to survive. Dwayne Johnson is not a myth. He is a man who decided, in the silence of his worst moments, over and over again, that the story was not finished. What moment are you standing in right now? If this story moved you, if even one chapter reflected something of your own, leave a like, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you never miss the stories behind the legends. Because here, we do not simply celebrate the triumph, we honor everything it cost.